Hello everyone, and welcome back to deucescrack.com. This is Andrew BalugaWhale Sideman back with another episode of my series Good Bluff, Bad Bluff, where we talk about all kinds of different bluffs and what makes a bluff good and what makes a bluff bad, and so on and so forth. And so throughout the course of this series, we've basically been starting at the beginning and looking at first what a bluff was. That was episode 1. What is a bluff? And then episode 2 was pre-flop bluffing. When we raise pre-flop, are we bluffing? Are we not? And we found that most of the time when we raise pre-flop, we are actually bluffing. Not always, but most of the time. And then last time we talked about c-bet bluffing. So okay, let's say you started your bluff pre-flop, and then you decide that you're going to go ahead and maybe bluff again on the flop, which we sort of commonly know as a c-bet. And then at the very end, we started talking about sort of what do you do when someone else is bluffing against you? What do you do when you're facing a c-bet? But we didn't really get too deep into that. So in today's video, we're going to talk, we'll sort of get to that in a second, but we'll talk sort of about like dealing with aggression when your opponent is c-betting against you and you're thinking about bluffing. So a quick recap of what we've learned so far is that there are basically two kinds of bluffs. One is a classic bluff, which is basically betting to get your opponent to fold a better hand than you. So you have pocket 3s, he has pocket 4s, you bet, he folds, you win. That would be a classic bluff. But an advanced bluff would be something like you have pocket 3s, he has jack 10, you bet, and he folds. So even though you have a better hand than him, or let's say ace 4, ace 5 or something like that, even though you have a better hand than him, you still want him to fold because he has a lot of equity against you. And that's sort of one of the types of advanced bluffs there are. There's quite a few of them. There's betting to make your opponent make a mistake by folding with incorrect odds, or by folding a hand that he could have gotten you to fold, or so on and so forth. So by folding a part of his range that he shouldn't be folding in general, folding too often, you can bluff against that kind of thing, even though if your opponent actually makes a correct decision in terms of whether they have like a worse hand than you. Sometimes we want worse hands to fold. And then last time we talked about how raising preflop and c-betting are often tied together, so that when we raise preflop, it was often because in a passive game, we expected our opponents to call on the preflop and then fold on the flop a big majority of the time. And we did some math on that last time, which basically showed that, like, okay, c-betting is great in a lot of situations, and when you're in one of those situations, kind of you get a great benefit by raising preflop and then betting again. So those two things kind of go together. But another thing that we kind of discussed is that c-betting isn't really exempt from the normal rules of bluffing, that it is a bluff just like any other, and it has to kind of have some reason, whether it's a classic reason or one of the more advanced reasons. It has to kind of be thought out. It can't just be an automatic, okay, I raised, so now I have to bet kind of situation. And then we also talked a lot about how player types would change our ability to bluff, where sort of bad passive players might be very bluffable on the flop or on some turns, but bad aggressive players might be very rarely bluffable, but maybe they'd be bluffable on the river, which is something we'll talk about in a future video. About how table dynamics might influence our ability to bluff. So if there's more than one player on the flop, we can't c-bet bluff as often because we're going to get called way too much, and so on and so forth. But today, we're going to talk about what to do when facing a c-bet. So the subject matter of the day will be what is a float? How does a float work? What are the pros and cons of slow playing your bluffs on the flop as opposed to fast playing your bluffs? I know it sounds a little bit weird to think about slow playing or fast playing when you have a crappy hand, but that's actually the terminology we're going to use because it's not any different than if we actually did have a good hand. We'll talk a little bit about how do depth and table factors affect what happens when we are facing a c-bet. And then we'll talk about the difficulties and strategies involved in balancing multiple bluff ranges to give us sort of a complete picture of what to do when facing a c-bet. So let's do our brief history lesson again, as we've taken to doing. The evolution of the flop bluff. So basically, people discovered probably in like 2003 that c-betting was great. That raising preflop, bluffing preflop, and then like betting again on the flop was like really effective way to just print money. And so everybody started doing it, and for a really long time, even when I was playing, it was common for c-bet percentages to be 100. that you would just literally always bet whenever you raised pre-flop. And like, it sounds like ridiculous right now, but back then it was like that was a real thing. Like, c-betting percentages were literally 100%. That's just what you did. And so I remember actually also, like, at one point Cole South was like, I think people c-bet too much, and everyone was like, what? That's crazy. C-betting is amazing. But so basically what happened was, and sort of the reason why Cole said this, is that it became important to learn how to play against c-bets, because everyone was just c-betting all the time. And then because of that, you end up with the first kind of bluff or rebluff situation where you're like, this guy's actually bluffing here all the time, so maybe I should bluff. And then that was kind of how that developed for the first time in kind of wide use on flop situations in terms of flop bluffing. I know it all sounds like so natural and obvious now, but you have to understand where these things came from, and that old folks like me sort of witnessed a lot of these things developing in the first place. So two paths diverge. A regular raises to 3 big blinds in the mid position, and you call on the button, and you miss the flop. So we're not really going to talk about what we have. We're just going to say that we had a crappy hand and missed the flop. But we get an idea. We assume that if our opponent is c-betting 100% of hands, and that he misses the flop 60% of the time, which is about right for kind of a lot of ranges, and that he folds to a flop raise whenever he misses. So these are, again, some pretty big assumptions here, but we'll treat it like we're philosophy students and sort of deal with these premises. Then, if we do some simple math, we'll say that, okay, the pot pre-flop, after the pre-flop action was 7 big blinds, his raise, our call, and let's call the big blind, minus the small blind for rake. And he c-bets 4 big blinds, which makes the whole pot 11 big blinds. And if we were to raise to 8 big blinds, we only need that to work 42% of the time to break even. But our assumption is that if our opponent is folding 60% of the time when he misses, that this should work much more often than that. So this seems to be like a great thing to do, right? Let's just start min-raising flops against people who c-bet too much. Cool. Well, let's take this even a little bit further. Even if we have to make it 30 or 13 big blinds to win the same amount. So, like, let's say, some of you out there are saying, well, if we made a min raise to 8 big blinds, like, we might not get very much fold equity, or maybe those numbers don't actually work. But even if we make it much larger, so this is more than 3x his raise, or his c-bet on the flop, we still achieve 60% fold equity, we're still definitely in the green. Like, I think I did the math the other day, but 13 big blinds was something like, you needed to work like 55 or 56% of the time. It still works. Awesome. Great. And this, of course, is before we even include any kind of pot equity, or maybe we have a draw or something like that, or overcards or something we might be able to hit and maybe win more money, even after this. And sort of we've kept that constant in our discussions of bluffing, which is without even factoring in pot equity, which is another barrel of worms. We're just thinking in general about, what is... what would it have to be without even considering equity? So if you were to imagine that, like, with a flop or pre-flop or something like that, or the turn, which we'll talk about another time, we're like no equity streets like the river is, where there's no more equity left, then we basically find that, like, okay, this is kind of amazing. Whether kind of no matter how big we want to raise the flop, given these sets of premises that our opponent folds when he misses 60% of the time, and that our opponent c-bets always when he raises 100% of the time, this ends up being like just a money print. Yay! Well, but wait. If we assume that let's make our assumptions a little bit more complex. If we assume that he folds to action when he misses, so folds to us playing back, whether it's on the flop or the turn, and if he always bets his value hands on the turn, if we flat the flop, but he never bluffs the turn unless he has like a very strong hand, which is sort of a little bit rare, so we're not so worried about it, then it seems like it might be better to float than it is to raise. So to quickly define a float is when you call a flop bet with the intention of bluffing the turn, or honestly with the intention of bluffing a later street. in a sense, floating is a bluff. It is tied to other bluffs. You cannot just float and then like not bluff. Floating is counting as essentially a slow played bluff. Now, there are some major benefits here. We'll get more into the pros and cons of these in a second, but we can see that floating, if these things also stay true, might have some major benefits. So let's see if we can explore this maybe in a little bit more detail. So we've got this pros and cons sheet of flop bluff versus flop float. So let's start over here with the flop float, since we're sort of talking about that. One of the main reasons why you should just call the flop instead of raising the flop is because if you have some equity, you get to capitalize on it. So let's say, for example, you have king queen on a 10-9-3 board. Well, if your opponent has a hand like pocket tens, hitting your jack is extremely valuable. Let's say this: if your opponent has a hand like pocket jacks, hitting your jack is extremely valuable. But hitting a queen or a king are also extremely valuable too. I mean, they're also like things that make you win. But if you were to raise the flop, let's say there's a flush draw on the board, so 10-9-3 flush draw board. If you were to raise the flop with king queen on that board, you might actually see some re-raises, which might cause you to fold your hand or fold your equity. So being able to just call allows you to capitalize and try to hit in this example, your 8-outer, but your very valuable 8-outer against your opponent. It also lets you see what your opponent's going to do. So if your opponent has some part of his range that c-bets the flop but check folds the turn, you'll be able to capitalize on that part of his range that sort of has stopped bluffing and be able to kind of bet and move him off it more safely. Obviously there's some elements of that as well. We'll talk about in a second. It's also like kind of easier to balance a flop float because it's way more easy to end up in the medium value range, i.e. hands that are like top pair or some kind of medium strength hand that you're not really excited to raise for value. It's way easier to end up there than it is to end up in that really high end value range, like would be happy to get it in on the flop situation. And so in this sense, it's a lot easier to just say like, well, I'm just going to throw these things, throw this bluff into my calling range, where I can represent kind of a wide range of things, anything from medium strength hands to like draws to total air to like very strong nuttish slow played monster hands. So in that sense, there are kind of lots of reasons to think about floating as a positive way to bluff, but there are some downsides. So just like how we can capitalize on our equity when we get to see a turn card, so does our opponent. So let's sort of give our opponent, for example, a hand like let's say that the board is 10-9-4 with 2 spades, and our opponent has a hand like ace jack with the ace of spades. Now he's going to fold this to some action because it's not super strong. But if we call and the turn card is, say, like a 5 of spades, he's certainly going to barrel us in a spot with a hand that he would have otherwise folded had we just gone ahead and raised the flop. So he was able to capitalize on some equity. Or let's say if our opponent had something like ace-5 suited, a hand that he might have folded to flop action, and then let's say he turns an ace, like we're giving him a chance to capitalize on that own equity, on his own equity, even though like we could have had him fold that equity earlier. So in that sense, there's the downside of letting your opponent catch up. The part about balancing, actually we'll come back to the part about balancing because I put these in the wrong order. The part about gaining valuable information, so we talked about, okay, well, if our opponent is going to, let's say check fold a whole bunch on the turn, then we gain a lot of information when we call because we can see that he would be betting the turn himself with his value hands and check folding with his weak hands. So like that would be useful, but that's not always the case. Our opponent has a lot of recourses he can take to prevent that from happening. So one of them might be he could check strong hands. Sometimes he'll check like a maybe top pair weak kicker. Sometimes he'll check a monster hand, go for a check raise. So in that sense, we don't necessarily know that every time he checks, he's weak. Or on the other hand, he might just barrel a lot of the time. So this is one problem that people get with floating too much in more aggressive games is like you float. One of the big advantages of floating is to kind of see what your opponent's going to do. But if your opponent's like likely to keep betting, with like a huge part of his range, then you don't actually gain much information. His range doesn't actually change very much. So in that sense, you don't always gain valuable information by playing slowly. You can against some opponents, but not always. Um, and then last but not least, on the con side of these flop floats, is that you actually represent kind of a lot of what you have, especially nowadays where people have become. Sorry about that, a little technical difficulty. Especially nowadays, now that people have gotten quite splashy, it's become quite difficult to represent anything but like weak hands when you float the flop. So in that sense, your opponent kind of has a license to be really aggressive against you when, even though you're so-called like you should be balanced, you oftentimes aren't really quite balanced because you might be over floating or over bluffing there in general, which is really, really common to do. You basically don't necessarily represent a difficult to play against balanced range. You represent like a lot of floats. Now, what are some of the pros and cons of instead of slow playing the flop and slow playing that type of thing? What happens if we think about fast playing? So there are some major advantages to raising the flop. I sort of feel like the raising like flop bluff races have kind of gone the way of the dodo and are like slowly becoming extinct from our world. But there are some major benefits. So number one, you can get your opponent to fold equity now. So let's take King Queen on that 10-9-4 board. Getting your opponent to fold Ace Jack now is kind of useful, especially if he's really likely to stay really aggressive, even when you miss. So that could be useful for sure. It also can be really useful if you're trying to get a lot of money into the pot in a spot where your opponent might not always be so willing. So let's say your opponent has pocket aces, and the board is this 10-9-3 board, and you raise and he flats. If you hit a jack, you're really likely to get all the money in. But if you just floated and, like, say, tried to raise the turn when a jack shows up, it's going to be harder to get the money in because now the board is like getting quite scary. And the pot, there's still like basically a lot of depth behind. And so basically, the deeper that you are behind, the harder it is to get money in with weaker hands. So reducing that stack to pot ratio can oftentimes mean that you'll get better implied odds and less fear of the board running out in a bad way when it doesn't go very well. And then it also does a lot to develop your image. People hate getting raised on the flop. They really dislike it. It makes them feel like they're being taken advantage of. And so I think there's definitely something to be said for building image like that and getting some attention sent your way from bluffing the flop a lot or bluff raising the flop. Now the cons, some of these we've discussed, which are that number one, it's a little bit hard to it's a really bad thing if you have equity to get blown off your equity. And it's a really bad thing. These last two ones are tied. If you can't really find a way to balance it, so it's very common for people who want to like bluff raise the flop to just do it too often, the same way that people who like 3-bet pre-flop do it too often. Basically you have a million combos of bluffs. It's really easy to have lots of bluff combos, so you don't want to represent when you are, represent bluffs when you are bluffing. Now, part of this is the problem of playing with a wide range in general. We see this happens like both on the flop bluff and on the flop float side, which is that if we're going to be bluffing a lot, there's the fear that we will be over bluffing kind of constantly. There's also the danger of if we decide to raise the flop, of over bluffing in spots that basically getting more money in bad. Even if the board doesn't turn out very well for us. So hypothetically, something like we raise the flop with King Queen and get called on this 10-9-4 board and get called by some hand, and then the turn card is a queen, and we, let's say, decide to value off or bluff off and get called down by a set or something better than us. So there's sort of danger of getting more money in bad after this. But again, that's the danger in both sides, but it's certainly more significant if we're going to start immediately reducing stack to pot ratios on the flop. Okay. Moving on, if I can find my mouse. Okay, so the math that we looked at before, the very simple math, that seemed so wonderfully in favor of us just like bluffing the flop or bluffing the turn or bluffing all over the place, especially the flop raise though, that was so great, turns out doesn't always hold up, even if we make just a small number of changes. So a few of those changes might be, if we have an opponent who's plays tighter, they miss the flop less often. This is something that I'm always astounded by how few people actually fully understand this, or like how many people that I talk to, like just don't even think about this. Um, if you play only pocket aces, you basically never miss the flop. There's this like some kind of mantra in like learning poker that everyone misses the flop 2/3 of the time, like that's the standard, but that's like not true. um, a bad aggressive player who has playing 100% of hands misses the flop a lot more than 30% of the time. Even the very definition of what missing the flop means could be unusual. If you have 7 deuce and the board comes down ace king deuce, did you miss the flop? Did you hit the flop? If you have ace king and the board comes down deuce deuce deuce, did you miss the flop? It's a little bit a difficult sort of wishy-washy terminology to know kind of exactly what you're doing, but the tighter that you get, the less often that you're going to miss the flop. So if you're playing against kind of a nitty player, the whole idea of he misses the flop 2/3 of the time just might not be true. He might miss the flop like half the time, which would make our math work out much less often. No, half the time it still works. If we want to do, let's say, the min raise on the flop against somebody like that, if it works half the time, but we certainly couldn't make it the 13 big blind raise on the flop against somebody who's playing that tightly. Laggy opponents, the ones who often tend to have these sort of really wide ranges that would miss the flop, maybe let's call it 2/3 of the time, are also tend to be the same kind of person who doesn't like to fold the flop to a raise, or doesn't like, he's afraid of being bluffed. So in this case, like, even though the range is wide enough that your opponent misses the flop, the problem that he doesn't fold it whenever he misses the flop, which makes it somewhat challenging to actually take advantage of the fact that his range is so wide. Now, this obviously, the perceptive viewers out there should be sort of saying, well, if he's playing a really wide range and never folding the flop, then I should get a ton of money with my value hands. And that is correct, which is why in general we tend to not try to bluff against bad aggressive players who are often, just have these super wide ranges and aren't likely to fold them even when they missed. So those two things really will make the math work out a lot less well. Now the other variable, the other premise that we had was that your opponent would be c-betting 100% of the time. Now obviously nowadays that's not true, and so you could imagine that their missed flop when c-bet percentage or their c-bet bluff percentage is going to be much lower if they're not c-betting 100% than it would be if they are. And so very commonly players are avoiding over-bluffing their c-bets, which means that you basically have to sort of adjust tremendously and understand that, okay, well, if someone is not over bluffing their c-bets, if they're only, let's say, c-betting like half the time on this board, and let's say they're started off and they're not that loose, then c-bet bluffing, or then even bluffing of any kind against this person might not be super awesome. And then last but not least, a perceptive opponent might notice if you're over bluffing a lot and might adjust to the point where they're just like playing tighter and never folding to your bluff races. This happens a lot pre-flop, where let's say that someone thinks you're 3-betting a lot on the button, they might just take a hand like broadways and say I'm just going to 4-bet anytime I have broadways and get 3-bet, which seems fine, except for if they're, let's say, raising from mid position, their range might be composed of premium hands and broadways and not much else. And if that's the case, then they're basically 4-betting you always. Which means that a perceptive opponent might be folding less often, playing tighter, not c-betting too much, and so just essentially having a great range geared against you trying to defend against c-bets. So this is something that sort of the math can easily cause someone to change. Now, not everyone does this. Obviously, many players still don't worry so much about overbluffing their c-bets and just keep doing it. Or many opponents are not perceptive and not noticing if you overbluff, and so they aren't adjusting. So this is just things to think about as you're trying to decide how loose you want to go. So how often should you bluff? So the first thing let's talk about is exploitation. These things are sort of recommendations that you could do to take advantage of your opponent being too unbalanced in a certain direction. So this would be they do X thing too often and not Y thing enough. Not balance, which we'll talk about balance in just a moment. So the first thing that I'd look for about knowing how often to bluff would be player types, because certain personalities are going to be more or less willing to be bluffed. So a bad passive player might be very willing to be bluffed, especially on the flop and pre-flop, but especially on the flop. A bad aggressive player might be very unwilling to be bluffed. A thinking player could come in all kinds of different ways, could be very willing to be bluffed, which traditionally I have been very willing to be bluffed, or very unwilling to be bluffed. Traditionally, some other regulars just hate being bluffed, and so they would rather go broke than bluff, or than be bluffed. C-bet percentage, I know I don't use stats very often, but C-bet percentage is a good rough guide to give you a sense of how often someone is C-betting. Obviously, stats tend to be a very general guideline, so someone's C-bet percentage in general might not describe their C-bet percentage in a heads-up pot with you. It might describe, like, maybe if they C-bet 55% of the time, that could actually be a very high number if your opponent is, let's say, involved in a lot of multi-way pots and is giving up a lot or something like that. Or especially a high number if they do some alternative things like, say, check calling the flop with hands like top pair no kicker, or check folding the flop, or check calling or check raising the flop with, like, very, very strong things. So in that sense, like, the C-bet percentage is a useful thing to look for, but not super ultra valuable. However, these next two things on this list are really valuable. So, does your opponent check fold the flop in heads-up pots? This is one that immediately should set off like major warning bells when you see it, and it's kind of a challenging thing to train yourself to do, just because of how often something like that happens and you just ignore it. Like, you flop nothing, he checks, you put a stab out at it, and he folds, and you think to yourself, okay, whatever, next hand. Whereas really what that should be telling you is, I need to be very careful about bluffing against this person's C-bets, because they are clearly like narrowing and strengthening their range for whenever it is that they decide to actually bet. Does he check call the flop with hands like top pair no kicker? If this is the case, then you should definitely want to increase your bluffing range on the flop, because it's much harder for your opponent to actually have like as many strong hands as he would like to represent. So if your opponent, let's say, only bluffs 50% of the time, but he like can never have top pair in his bluffing range, or in his value range. Sorry, let me rephrase it. He c-bets the flop 50% of the time, but he never has top pair, which means his bluff range is much larger part of that 50% than his value range would be compared to somebody else. Another thing to sort of pay attention to would be your opponent's board texture, or his opponent's strategy on different board textures. Does your opponent always c-bet, like let's say that you do put in a flop raise or something like that on an ace-high board. Does your opponent just like snap fold to these things? Is he c-betting all of his air on these boards? Certain boards are likely to take 100% c-bets. Certain boards are likely to take much lower c-bets. Does your opponent check fold on a jack 10-9 board but not an ace-7 deuce board? That's a big question to know when we're thinking about how often we should bluff on different ones. Maybe we shouldn't bluff very often at all on a jack 10-9 board because your opponent just check folds always and check calls ace-jack, right? Maybe we should bluff all the time on a jack 10-9 board if our opponent like is firing out all pieces of everything. It's important to kind of pay attention to that. And again, if you're going to bluff, this is from the last time as well, equity is really important because the more equity you have, the more likely you are to win, which makes sort of like all of your bluffs become better. And to remember that floating is bluffing. So doing a no equity float is not any better than doing a no equity bluff raise. They're just two ways of expressing the same thing. And the problem with them is that like not having any way to win the pot, like by actually making a big hand or not having any implied odds of any kind, makes these sort of things much worse. Anyway, moving on. So, some things to consider. When should I raise? When should I float? So the first thing that my sort of general guideline would be is that if you have a lot of equity in the pot, raising becomes worse. Unless you have so much equity that you basically are never going to fold. So like you would not be bad. It wouldn't be bad to raise like the nut flush draw, or to raise like a big combo draw or something like that. But if you have something like the king queen hand on the 10-9-4 board, that would probably count as a lot of equity that you wouldn't really want to fold. So generally, if you have a lot of equity, you prefer to float and see your equity, and if you don't, you prefer to raise, which is kind of similar to pre-flop, where if you have like a lot of equity, like say king queen, you prefer to kind of flat and see it, as opposed to if you don't have so much equity, like say king nine, you might prefer to raise or fold. And then sort of have put in raise fold there as your options when you don't have a lot of equity. Obviously, you can always fold a hand if you don't have very much equity. The next question is, are we deep? Because generally, if we're deep, we can be a little bit less afraid of being blown off of our equity, because A, it's harder to give us odds that we can't continue with because there's so much more money that we can potentially win. But B, it's also harder for our opponent to like play back at us too much, because the reverse implied odds of like getting it over your head when deep are much worse. So in general, when we're deep, we can kind of get away with a lot more raising, even with equity, than otherwise. But when we're not deep, if it's just really easy for our opponent to come over the top and or just get it in with us. So this is why, like in general, slow playing most things are better when shallow than when deep, because it's just really, really easy to get all the money in when you're shallow. Like if you're in a tournament and you have 10 big blinds, you get dealt pocket aces, like you should slow play it. If you're in a cash game and you get dealt pocket aces or a bluff, they're probably both better off in general slow played when shallow. In fact, this is almost like the idea of like the stop and go in tournaments, where if you have like 7 big blinds pre-flop and the button opens, you're better off like doing a stop and go than you are doing like a straight reship, because you're kind of more able to get you're not able to get any folds pre-flop, but like you might be able to get like some folds on a later street. So there's something worth thinking about that. And then last but not least, is the board likely to change a lot? So if the board is like, say, 7-6-5, this is a great spot for you to raise as a bluff, because there's lots of things that could happen that would make it very, very difficult for your opponent to continue, like would sort of make the board less positive for an overpair, something like, say, an 8, a 9, a 4, so what was the board? 7-6-5? So an 8, a 9, a 4, a 3, a flush card, or a big card are all cards that like might make your opponent not that excited to continue with his hand. So in that sense, when the board's likely to change a lot, raising is generally better than floating. Also, when your opponent has like a hand, like, so let's say, I don't know, like ace 10 with a backdoor flush draw there's a lot of stuff that they might decide to barrel on that 7-6-5 board, but they would give up. Whereas if the board is likely to not change a lot, so let's say the board is like king 7-3, there's not so much your opponent can do with ace 10 there. Let's even like ace 8 suited there or something like that. So in general, like the board's kind of going to stay more or less static. You're usually better off thinking about floating. And then another thing to think about is ranges. As always in poker, ranges are really important. But so there's a big question here, which is sort of like, do you want to balance more than one range? Now, one of the things in No Limit Hold'em especially, and the reason why this is like why I think that like a game theory solution is like pretty far away, is that there are so many different options you could choose to balance. So you could choose to have a flop floating range, and a flop min raising range, and a flop 2.5x raise, and a 3x, and a 3.5, and a 3.75, and a 7x raise, and you could have a million different ranges that you might want to balance. So do you want to even have more than one in the first place? And a lot of players would say that their lives are just easier, that things make more sense, that they have less to worry about when they just balance one range. Right, when it's just, I just float the flop, or I just raise the flop. Most likely it's I just float the flop. I think that you should have at least 2 ranges, but it doesn't always have to be balanced for the intention of balancing, or with that intent. You could say something along the lines of like, in general, it might work out that I can have roughly a balanced assortment of some flop floats and some flop raises with about value hands and bluffs and so on and so forth. But usually that will sort of come about by trying to use game flow to figure out what the best thing is to do. So if your opponent seems like he's just ready to get it in, or like his bet size seems to be like he has a big hand, you might want to like not raise the flop as a bluff, but raise it for value instead. And if on the reverse, if your opponent bets like really small, you might want to like just flop the flop and try to get value on a later street or something like that. So in this sense, like, do we end up being balanced? We should, but we don't necessarily have to do it on purpose. And more than anything, you need to be kind of conscious within your own range of whether or not you are in danger of overbluffing. It's really easy to tell yourself, this is just like the one hand that I would do this with. But then you have to think about combos and be like, well, is it actually like all of the hands? So like, let's say, for example, I was talking with a friend about a hand in heads up where he check called the flop with like queen high on an ace king board, and then check raised the turn. When the flush came, he had a backdoor flush draw. So there's 2 spades on the flop. Turn card is another spade, and he check raised. And he's like, yeah, but like this is like my one bluff is this queen X off with the queen of spades. And it's like, well, I mean, there's a lot of combos of that. Like even if that's your one bluff, it's very, very easy to have just like too many of those. I mean, if you're gonna say like, my only bluff pre-flop is ace X offsuit when I 3-bet, like that's a lot of combos of bluffs if you 3-bet every time you get ace X offsuit. So just be careful, especially when you have wide ranges. So things like blind versus blind, heads up, playing against laggy opponents, deep stacked, etc. Just be careful that you don't find yourself in a situation where you overbluff like too significantly, and it's too easy for your opponent to take advantage of you. Okay. And then last but not least, for this video, have a plan. So a lot of this is sort of, as we move through the course of this series, we're seeing that these bluffs are kind of not really self-contained within one street. So like a value bet, you can just say pretty concretely, like, I have better equity than my opponent, he will call me with a worse hand, so I will value bet. Whereas with a bluff, you can't really just say, I have worse equity than my opponent, well, I mean, and he'll fold right now, then I'll bet. So that's good, but you can't, sometimes you'll say, I have worse equity than my opponent, and he won't fold right now, but he will fold later. And even more complicated than that, he will fold later on X and Y turn cards, but not Z turn card, right? Or he will fold to X turn card plus bet size alpha, but not Y turn card plus Z, plus beta bet size or whatever, making things more challenging for myself than they need to be. But so bluffing is kind of something that actually is going to run throughout the course of a hand, whereas value bets kind of move like piece by piece on their way forward. So that's kind of the reason why we're doing this series the way we are. So some things to think about when you're trying to construct your plan. What will happen if your flop raise is called, right? Is this a board where you'll be able to represent things that you can get your opponent to fold? Or is this a board where your opponent is just like going to wait for a safe turn card and check ship? If you decide to float, what are you going to do if your opponent bets on certain different types of turn cards? So if there's a wet turn card, will your opponent bluff it with all kinds of things? If it's a dry turn card, will your opponent give check fold always? And then some things to think about for next time, which is next time we'll talk about when should we consider continuing our bluff when our opponent like bets the turn. So let's say we float the flop and our opponent bets the turn anyway. When do we decide that we're gonna like float that or raise again? And how do we consider extending our bluff to the river? And what does that mean? So like, when are we taking a bet on the turn and saying, this is a good spot for us to go for a river raise? Or, this is a spot where I'll call one more street but fold to a river bet. How do we determine some of those things? So that's kind of the plan going forward. And hopefully this has been at least a little bit interesting. We'll talk about, next time we'll talk about sort of facing aggression on the turn and thinking about river bluffs, and then we'll probably do a collection of videos where we're just looking at a bunch of hands and seeing kind of what bluffs look good and what bluffs don't. So anyway, thank you guys for watching. This has been Andrew BalugaWhale Sideman, only here on deucescrack.com for Good Bluff, Bad Bluff, and I will see you guys next time, but until then, leave a message in the comments and good luck.